Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Let me give you my unabashed, um, this is my advertisement for the Grace app, if you will. What the Grace app contains, and it's a free downloaded app, it contains all of our devotional studies. And by the way, our devotional studies have now reached almost 300,000 people around the world. It contains all of our study guides that you can download. It contains our entire archived podcast. Every podcast we've ever done is archived on the Grace app. It contains all the events that are happening with Grace School of Theology and Grace Center for Spiritual Development. It contains multiple things that you can do, as well as an access directly into our bookstore, directly into the seminary, directly into the Grace Center for Spiritual Development. So anything that you want that we've actually pushed through into a public offering is there and available for you on your phone with the Grace app. So again, my unabashed marketing for the Grace app, please download it, please get it, please share it, please tell people about it, because that's where also coming in 2019 we'll be loading up our on-demand online training. So all of our course offerings that we're going to have that you'll be able to take either for free or fee-based will be coming through the Grace app as well. So get in early, get in now. It's a really cool application to keep you in tune with all the things that we're doing. So that's my advertisement. Let me get us started this morning. Welcome. Let me tell you a quick story to kind of get us started to where we left off last week. Diane, I'm going to tell another story on my dog.
Yay.
We had a little border terrier. Melissa and I had a little border terrier. Her name was Emma. And when we moved into our first house in Midland, it had a very thick wall that we put a dog door in so that she could have access outside. But this dog door was not just a simple flap. It was almost like a tunnel. It was probably 15 to 20 inches long. And our dog was only 15 to 20 inches long. So the first time she used it, she came up to it. We had to lift the flap for her. She kind of put her front paws into the tunnel. And so what you saw from our end was just her backside sticking out of the dog door, her front part in the dog door, and her nose pushing the outer flap up, and she was peeking out into the backyard. And what you got was this look of somebody who was peeking but not committed. She hadn't yet committed to getting into that door and out the door. And so we saw kind of the backside of her and then partly in, then all of a sudden she began to use the door. Well, this is a very good descriptor of where Naomi is right now. Naomi has returned. She's peeking into the land of blessing, but she hasn't yet committed to it. She's returned, and we know this, she's returned because there's food. Coming in tow with her is Ruth. She comes back and she says, I went out full. God, you brought me back empty. It's your fault I'm in the situation I'm in. I walk into Bethlehem. All my friends see me. And what we get from this marvelous storyteller is that they came to Bethlehem, the last part of verse 22 in chapter 1, they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. We get this wonderful statement from the storyteller that things are about to change for Naomi and Ruth. Now remember, we said it in our last couple of times together that there were two very distinct things that they needed in order to survive. What were they? One was food, the other was children. The legacy, the continuation of the line. So what the storyteller tells us at the end of chapter 1 is, and granted there weren't chapters when this story was being told, but here's what the Jewish storyteller would say. They came back to Bethlehem at just the right time, the beginning of the barley harvest, which means now that she has returned physically to the land, the blessing of food looks like it could begin to be solved. We still have the blessing of children, that survival necessity of children to look at, but we get this wonderful statement, she's returned physically, and even as she has returned, God begins to bless. and he blesses with the beginning of the barley harvest. So that's where we end what I call in chapter 1, I look at that called the returning to the covenant relationship. Chapter 2, I'm looking at as a recognition of the covenant relationship because we're going to introduce a new character in chapter 2. This is a character in the name of Boaz who understands and sees the covenant relationship as Ruth does, as Naomi did. So we're going to look at them coming in, and I want you to notice in chapter 2 in specific, I want you to notice the emphasis that's going to be on obedience in the small things of life. The obedience to the small things of life. We're going to see this over and over and over again. The contrast continues between Naomi and Ruth. We now bring a new character in, and God is going to continue to bless and show his blessing, but we're going to see it come about because of an obedience to the very small things. So, starting in chapter 2, we're going to look at the first 4 verses to begin. And I want you to just see again how marvelous this storyteller is in unfolding the story for us. Starts in verse 1. There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. Verse 2. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him in whose sight I may find favor. Naomi said to her, go, my daughter. Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Now let me back up and let's dive in very deeply into this. The storyteller gives us wonderful descriptive phrases and words specifically for this new character. First of all, he says, there was a relative of Naomi's husband. So there's 2 words right there. This is a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. Now there's about 5 descriptive words of Boaz here. But here's the first thing I want you to notice. Chapter 1, verse 22 ends with, at the beginning of the barley harvest. Chapter 2, verse 1 begins with, there was a relative. There is family. All of a sudden, we see the potential that food is going to be, that issue of survival is going to be potentially solved. But now, all of a sudden, she comes back, and we find for the first time that there is additional family in the land of blessing. Naomi has other family in the land of blessing. So there is a relative. It's a relative of Naomi's husband. He is a man of great wealth. Let me come back to that in just a minute. And he's of the family of Elimelech. So we get this. Remember I said that in the Hebrew language there aren't a whole lot of adjectives, so repetition means emphasis. So he's now said that there is a relative of Naomi's husband of the family of Elimelech. Do you think he's trying to tell us something here?
Yeah.
Pay attention. This character is exceptionally important and very important to our main character, Naomi, because he is a relative of Naomi's husband, whose husband is Elimelech. So he's in the family of my God is king, Elimelech, and he is a man of great wealth. Now, that little word, that little phrase, a man of great wealth, it's a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word for wealth is literally this. It's called hayil, Hayil, hayil. And here's what it means. It was a word that was used of Gideon when he was called a mighty man of valor. Gideon was called a hayil, a mighty man of valor. Boaz is called a man of great wealth. Now, that doesn't just mean that he had property and he had status. It means he had great wealth of character. And we're going to see that magnificently unfolded in these first 13 verses. But he is a man of valor. He is a man of character. It's also, by the way, this is a word that's going to be used of Ruth in chapter 3 to say she is a virtuous woman. So this is a person of virtue. This is a person of great character. And his name is Boaz. Boaz translated in the Hebrew means swift strength. Swift strength. Now, think of all the superlatives that have just been stated about this man before we know anything about him. We know he's a man of incredible character. We know he's a man of great valor. We know he's a man whose name means swift strength. We know he is a relative of my God is King, Elimelech, and he has remained in the land during the famine. This is who Boaz is. And I ask myself the question when I hear this, and I hear him introduced every time, this is how he is known. This is how the storyteller describes him, so this is how he is known. My question is, how am I known? How are you known? What would other people say about you if they were describing you? How would you be known? Now, understand, I'm not trying to say here that how other people view you is something that you ought to be aspiring to, but I am saying that by your character, by what you say and by what you do, you're known a certain way. Boaz was known specifically as a Hayil, a man of great valor, a man of incredible character. And his name, Swift Strength, is a name, boy, I wish my name was Swift Strength. I looked up my name. My name means God of War. That's not quite the name I'd like to have. I would love a name that meant Swift Strength, Boaz. Now, I wouldn't like my name to be Boaz, but what it means, I think Swift Strength Boaz is a great name for a dog, but here's this wonderful name, this wonderful person. So let me ask the second question, and this is the other one that hits me. Boaz is known as a mighty man of valor. What am I doing in my life? What are you doing in your life that would lead you to become, that would shape you and mold you into a Hayil, into a virtuous person, into a person of great character and a person of wealth of character? What are you doing in your life that would lead you to be known that way? And it's a really convicting question, I think, that we get this opening statement about Boaz. And by the way, chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 2, 3, and 4 are going to unfold Boaz's character. And he's going to be proven to be the man that the storytellers just told us he is. So we get introduced to this new relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great Hayil, a man of wonderful wealth of character, of the family of my God is King, and his name is Swift Strength. This is who he is. This is the character we just get introduced to. Verse 2, and by contrast, look at what the storyteller tells us. So Ruth, and how is she described? Ruth, let's put it this way. So here is Ruth, the outcast. See the contrast that he's set up here? Here is this mighty man of valor who stayed in the land. He's followed the covenant promise. And here is Ruth. By contrast, let's not forget, she is an outcast. But watch what the outcast does. Ruth, the Moabitess, the outcast, said to Naomi, pleasant, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Now, there's a couple things we need to really dive into here. The first thing that Ruth does something that is promised in the law of Moses. In Deuteronomy 22, in Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 24, what the wealthy landowners were commanded by God was to leave the gleanings in the field. Now, what the gleanings were was when the reapers came in to harvest the harvest, anything that fell off the cart, anything that was left behind, they were purposefully supposed to leave it for the widows, the orphans, and the poor, so that they could come and glean, pick up the remains of the harvest that was left on the ground for them. And therefore, God provided for, out of the abundance of the crop, not out of a sacrifice of your crop, but out of the abundance of the crop, he provided for the poor, the widows, and the orphans. Again, you can look at very specifically, the command is to leave the gleanings behind so that the widows, the poor, and the orphans, when they can come into the fields and they can glean the leftovers so that they have something to eat. So who is it in verse 2 that requests to go gleaning?
Ruth.
The outcast, the Moabitess. Who is the one that actually is following the covenant promise?
Ruth,
The outcast, Ruth the Moabitess. She says to Naomi, let me go into the field and glean the heads of grain after him in whose sight I might. Now the word favor here, I'm going to teach you another little Hebrew word. Favor here, this is the word chen, C-H-E-N, chen. You say it again like this is allergy season. You got a lot of phlegm in the back of your throat, so you just say chen. And what chen means, chen is the word we get in the New Testament. It's the word we get for grace. So what she says here is, let me go glean in the fields after the reapers, in whose sight, in somebody's field, in whose sight I might find grace. That someone might have graced me by leaving their gleanings behind for me to do this. So what she's really saying is, let me go glean in the fields of somebody who understands the covenant promise that God makes, that the gleanings will be left behind so that I can go feed. Now remember, what vow has she made to Naomi? To care for her? To never leave her? So what's she doing? She is holding to her covenant promise to care for Naomi by going into the fields and gleaning and finding food for the two of them. And she's doing it under the covenant umbrella that God has placed that says, wealthy landowners, leave your gleaning so the poor, the widows, the orphans have something to eat. You see how grace just kind of abounds everywhere you look? So here's what Naomi says, and it's a fascinating thing. She says, go, my daughter. So how does she now describe Ruth?
Her daughter.
She an outcast?
No.
She's not an outcast anymore. Way to go, Naomi. But here's my question. Does Naomi know that there's a relative in the land?
Yes. Sure. She does.
And does Naomi know the covenant promise of gleanings?
Yes.
So why isn't Naomi walking out the door to go with her to go glean?
She's old? She's old?
Well,
she's nursing her
now,
grudge.
I love that. She's nursing her grudge. That's right. It's good. So there is some scholarship that suggests that because she's beyond childbearing years, she's too old to go do this. However, she's probably in her late 40s, early 50s. Certainly not beyond.
Prime of her life.
She's certainly not beyond the capability of going out and at least doing some small bit of gleaning. And if she knows that she has a relative in Boaz still in the town, why has she not gone immediately to say to Boaz, could we glean in your fields? This is, again, whoever said it, she's nursing her grudge. She's still a holdover. This is what I said. She's returned physically to the land, but she hasn't yet returned spiritually to the relationship with God. She's still saying, God, you brought me back empty. There's nothing here. And yet, the barley harvest is going on. There's a relative in the land. Ruth is going out to glean in the covenant promise. These blessings are just beginning to abundantly flow, but she's so focused on what she doesn't have that she can't see everything that God's beginning to provide.
Well, who would have told her? Wouldn't Naomi have told her about going out to glean? Yeah.
I think you're exactly right, which again begs the question, if Naomi told her to go out to glean, then why isn't Naomi going out to glean as well? Why is Ruth taking 100% of the initiative to go do this, to actually follow in the covenant promise? Now, hang on, because it's going to really get fun when we begin to see this. But remember at the beginning I said, this is obedience in the little things. Is this a small thing? Go out and glean in the field.
No, it's very small.
It's a big thing, but just to simply go glean, this was an agrarian society. Go out and collect the harvest. Go out and get food. So there was an obedience to what God had provided, the abundance that God wanted to give and bless. There's an obedience to that. And Ruth is following the obedience. Now, thankfully, Naomi didn't look at her and say, no, you got to sit in here and nurse the grudge with me. She just said, let's go. So we get at the end of verse 2, she says, go. And I just love the fact that Naomi calls her my daughter, because there's a recognition by the storyteller here that Ruth is now actually walking in the covenant promise she made to her in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. This covenant promise, I'm going to be with you and I'm going to care for you. So, verse 3, then, because Naomi said go, she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. Now, I want to make a statement to you here. Ruth does everything covenantally correct. Here's what you get. The reaping in the fields, you would have the owner of the field, who is Boaz in this case, we'll find out in a minute. Underneath Boaz, you would have his servants who were over the reapers. Then you would have the reapers who were under the servants, and you would have the male reapers and the female reapers. So there was a hierarchy: Boaz, servants, male reapers, female reapers, and then you would have the poor, the widows, and the orphans down here. So this is this is Ruth, who is an outcast, who is a widow, who is poor, who's coming into a field, and she's at the bottom of the food chain. And she walks into a field, verse 3, she left, went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. So she's doing it in the appropriate order. Notice the order. She's coming after the reapers. Boaz, servants, male reapers, female reapers, poor widows and orphans. Notice what she doesn't do. She doesn't walk into the field and say, excuse me, I'm a poor widow. You need to let me glean. The covenant law says you need to let me. She doesn't do that. She walks into the field after the reapers in her appropriate place. And watch what the storyteller says. She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who, by the way, was of the family of Elimelech, in case you didn't remember that from verse 1. I'm going to tell it to you again so you really understand. Look at where she's wandered in. Now, if we were to move this into today's vernacular, we would say this. By coincidence, she happened into the field. Now, I just want to ask you a question at this point. Have there been any parting of the Red Sea in this story yet? Have there been any miraculous God showing up in a pillar of cloud, a pillar of fire, God doing unbelievable, miraculous things? Has any of that happened in this story so far? But look at how the storyteller tells us she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Do we think by any far stretch that God's hand isn't at work right now? No, it is. Even in the small things, God has directed Ruth, who is walking in the covenant promise, to the right field of the right family of the right man. And look at what he has matched up. He's matched up a woman of character with a man of character. He's matched a woman who is walking in the covenant promise to a man who is walking in the covenant promise. This is obedience in the small things, and God settles himself into the midst of this and begins to orchestrate those events. Though what we don't see is, miraculously, Ruth found her way and fell in love immediately with Boaz. No, we're not going to get that. Well, let me make this statement right now, because you're never going to see this anywhere in the text. Nowhere in any of the text, in any of this entire story, are you going to see they fell in love. What you're going to find is they both loved God first. And God begins to orchestrate events for two people that love him first. They are following him in obedience. They are following after the covenant relationship. And God begins to orchestrate events. So she wanders into the field, belonging to swift strength, who is of the family of my God is king. Wow. What a place. Now, verse 4, now because this had all happened, behold, and I'm just going to tell you, anytime you see the word behold in Scripture, it basically means put your seatbelt on because something magnificent is happening. This is the angels declaring, behold, for unto you this day a Savior has been born. He is Christ the Lord. This is, anytime you see behold, it means something magnificent is happening and the storyteller wants to get your attention. Behold, Boaz came from where? So he's stayed in Bethlehem. He's in the house of bread. And he said to the reapers, notice who he's talking to. This is the boss, not talking to his servant. He's talking to whom?
The reapers.
The workers in the field. This was unheard of in the time, just by the way. The boss never talked to the workers in the field. The workers in the field talked to the servants who talked to the boss. This is a man of character. He recognizes people. He goes directly to the reapers. And look at what he says to the reapers. What does he say?
The Lord be with you.
So the master says to the workers, may the Lord bless you. The Lord be with you. I was in business for about 20 years. And I had a lot of people that worked underneath me. And I am sad to say that it was rare that I ever said to anybody who worked underneath me, the Lord be with you. Mm-hmm. But what a wonderful thing to say to somebody who you work with or who works alongside you or works under your command, under your authority, to say to them, the Lord bless you. Bless you. May the Lord bless you today. And look at the response of the reapers back to their master. The Lord bless you. What a marvelous character trait that Boaz had this kind of relationship with the workers in the field. These are contract laborers. These are the workers in the field that nobody's supposed to notice. But the storyteller's telling us that Boaz noticed them. This mighty Hiel, this man of valor, this man of character, noticed even the reapers, blessed them, and they blessed him. I can also tell you, there weren't a whole lot of people when I was in business that came to me and said, Mark, may the Lord bless you. Said a whole lot about just my mindset when I was in business. And though I held Bible studies and I was with people an awful lot, that wasn't the focus. And I'm sorry to say that wasn't the focus. For Boaz, this was the focus. The focus was blessing the people who worked with him. And they, in turn, blessed him back and gave all the credit to the Lord. It's a beautiful statement about seeing the Lord in everybody and everything. So we see the Lord at work in every person. We see the Lord at work in even the small things about reaping, gleaning. And we see it continue in verse 5. Boaz said to his servants, to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? So now understand, Boaz has been out in his field, so he's not the kind of master who sits up in his ivory tower and doesn't get his fingers dirty. He's out in the field. He's out in the field and he's talking to the reapers. He's out in the field and he's talking to his servants. He's out in the field and he's blessing everybody who's around him. He's scattering the blessing and scattering the grace. And he goes to his servant and he says, whose young woman is that? He's pointing at Ruth and he's saying, now she's somebody I don't know, which means he knows everybody else who's working in the fields. That's another great thing. And let me tell you a quick story about my dad. My dad ran a company for 25 years. And at its peak, this company had about 65 people that were working in the company. And my dad knew every single person. He walked out in the shop every single day. He said hi to every single person. He made sure that every single person knew him and he knew them. It was, my dad was a Boaz. That's the kind of guy my dad was. But every single person knew my dad. And he was the kind of guy that would go up and check on people, see how their family was, see what they were doing, see how life was treating them. And he was just that kind of guy. He reminded me a lot of this. He's out in the field. He's out in the workers. He's out doing the work, and right alongside of them. Boaz says to his servant, "Who is this young woman? Who is she? Tell me about who she is." And listen to what the servant says. Now we're going to begin to get the character of Ruth. The servant, who was in charge of the reapers, again, Boaz, servant, reapers, answered and said, look at how he first describes her. It is the young, what kind of woman?
Moabite.
Moabite. It's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. So let's just make sure we really understand she's a Moabite from Moab. If I haven't made it really clear, she's an outcast, she's an outcast, she's an outcast. She is a Moabite from Moab, though she came back with Naomi, who, by the way, again, if you're this Jewish audience, you're catching all these little clues of how the storyteller's laying this story out. But now look at what he says in verse 7. Now he begins to talk to her character. She's an outcast, the outcast of the outcast. And she said, verse 7, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. There's several things that this servant has just now described of Ruth. First of all, she came humbly. She said, please let me glean and gather, not at the front of the line, but after the reapers. She came humbly. She asked for the opportunity to be able to do what the covenant command of God said to do. She didn't demand it. She didn't claim it. She walked in and she said, please let me glean after the reapers. Now, remember, she's an outcast of outcasts, but she's walking in this covenant promise. And the first thing that we notice is that she does everything right covenantally. She asks, she comes in humbleness. She's done everything correct. And then look at how she's described by the servant. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. How's he describing her?
As a hard worker.
She's a hard worker. She hasn't come in and demanded, hey, I should be able to glean. Bring the gleanings over to me. I'm going to sit here by a rock. She's gone out and she's worked. She's worked hard in the field. She rested a little bit and she's worked hard in the field. She has done the work. Now understand, the Old Testament command of God, let them glean. But somebody still has to walk in the ability to glean. Somebody still has to go actually gather up that grain. This is Ruth, again, staying true to her covenant vow to Naomi. She's walking in it. She's doing all the right things at all the right places. Wouldn't you just love to know Ruth? This is an incredible woman. She's outcast. She comes in. She's a foreigner. She comes into a land. God directs her to the right place. She asks humbly. She works hard. She's noticed. You know, if we just said, how am I known? How's she known? Has she spoken a word yet? Other than, please let me glean? She hasn't said anything else. And yet, look at how she's described. She is described beautifully as a hard worker, humble in spirit. This is why we're going to see in chapter 3 her called a Hayil, a virtuous woman. This is, by the way, faithfulness. This is being faithful to walk in the promises that God has laid out. Because what she does is she came and has continued from morning until now. She has worked hard all day. And by the way, who's she working for?
Naomi and herself.
Yeah. She's doing this work on behalf of the covenant vow she made to Naomi so that she can care for Naomi. I'll say it again. This is a woman I'd really like to know. There's no entitlement here. There's no, I should get this because I'm a poor widow. She actually goes and does what she's supposed to do. So we get by the end of these, verse 7, we now have this wonderful interplay that the storyteller has given us. Food is now back into being. So the possibility of food is there, and the possibility of something else, at least family connection, is there, because she happens to wander into the field of Boaz, another man of character. God is setting up a wonderful interplay of what's going on here. So let's continue. We're now moving into verse 8. Let me share a story real quick. Chuck Colson tells this story, and it's a marvelous story. He was actually going to give a message to a group of 2,200 prisoners. And this was going to be a message where at the end of it, he was going to share the gospel. Well, as things happened, the prison system said 200 men in one room is too many. We're going to reduce that to 300. So he was a little bit put out that he wasn't going to get a chance to talk to all 2,200. And on the day before he was to arrive, there was a prison riot. They locked the prison down. And so Colson was going to come and he was going to speak to only maybe 2 or 3 or 4 men who were going to be allowed, who weren't participants, and they were going to be allowed to hear him. So he thought to himself, I think I'll just do a little 10-minute devotional, get in, get out, and be done. It's only going to be 3 or 4 men. I'm just going to do this small message. And he said the Holy Spirit stopped him and said, nope, you have a message to give. And whether it's 1 man or 1,000,000, you go give that message with all your passion and all your heart. So he did. There were 5 men. He gave the message. He got up to leave. The warden came over to him and he said, I'm just really sorry. Colson said, I'm just really sorry there couldn't have been more men. He said, well, then you haven't heard. And Colson said, heard what? He said, well, we videotaped the entire message. And the prison board now has said, not only is your message going to be given to all 2,200 men, but for the next month, it's going to be played at every single prison in our system. Oh, wow. So the gospel was heard because of his faithfulness to do this. And he said, I learned 3 lessons from this, and I love these 3 lessons. The first is this. He said, Mother Teresa was right. God calls us to faithfulness, not success. First lesson, God calls us to faithfulness, not success. Second, when our goal is to change society, we often fail. When it is simple obedience to God, He blesses our efforts more than we can imagine. And third, we should not grow weary in well-doing, for we shall reap a harvest if we faint not. I'll send those to you. You don't have to try to write them all down. Diane, I'll send them to you. You can pass them out.
All right. Thank you.
Those 3 lessons, just simple lessons about faithfulness. We're seeing that in Boaz, who is faithful to remain in the land. We see it in Ruth, who is faithful to get out in the field. We see it in God beginning to orchestrate between these 2 who were faithful to the covenant commands of God, the covenant promises of God, to walk in those and to even walk in those in the little things of life. That is a person of character. That is a person of valor. Starting in verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, now look at the change here. So Boaz has talked with the reapers. He's talked with the servants. Now who is he talking directly to?
Ruth.
He's talking directly to Ruth. He goes up to her and listen to what he says. You will listen. What does he call her?
My daughter.
Now just stop for a minute and think about if you were Ruth, an outcast in a strange field with all of these strange people around, and you're at the bottom of the food chain, and the master comes up to you and calls you by this term of endearment. How would you feel right now? Spectacular. Not only has he noticed me, but my goodness, he's now given me this term of endearment that isn't, you're a servant, you're a poor, you're a widow, you're an outcast, you're somebody who's just on the outskirts. He's now just made her day just simply by calling her my daughter. And he says to her, listen, my daughter, to what I have to say. And he's going to tell her now 5 things that he's telling her to do. First, he says, don't go glean in another field, nor go away from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. So here's what he says to her. He says, my daughter, don't glean in another field. Stay in this one. Does this sound like be blessed because you're in the land? Don't glean another field. Don't go away from here. Don't wander off. Stay in this field. The third thing he says is stay close to my women. Why? Because they know how to glean. They know where the good stuff is. Stay close to them. See where they reap. Follow after them. They're going to show you where to go. Follow them. And then he makes this statement. He says, and I've commanded the young men not to touch you. There's good reason for this. Twofold. Number one, she's an outcast from Moab. And by the way, an outcast from Moab you weren't supposed to have anything to do with them. And she's known as an outcast from Moab, that they might have done harm to her. So he's covering her with his protection. I've told the young men don't touch you. But second, she's a woman, and she's a young woman. Mm-hmm. These are men working out in the field, and he has commanded them, stay away from her. His protection is over her. So now he's not only provided the best of the food, he's provided protection. Let me put it this way. And then he moves from there and he says, now also go drink when you need to drink. This was unheard of for him to do for somebody who is at the bottom of the food chain, the lowest of the low here. He goes above and beyond. He didn't have to do all of this, just so you know. He didn't have to say to her, go glean. He could have just left her alone. And as a matter of fact, he was following the covenant promise simply to say, you're okay to glean in my fields, just to allow her to do that. Instead, what he does is not only glean in my fields, follow after my women, stay in my field, glean of the best. The men aren't going to touch you. And when you're thirsty, get something to drink. He has provided above and beyond the call of the law. He's gone above and beyond. Now, let me move you fast forward to Jesus in the New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount. If someone needs your shirt, give them your coat too, right? Go above and beyond. This is the heaping of burning coals. This is when you take the coals, when somebody runs out of fire, you take the coals that are in a bin on your head and you actually heap coals upon them. It's heaping blessing upon them. This is the blessing time and time again being heaped on them. And Boaz right now is heaping blessing upon blessing upon blessing on Ruth. And by the world's standards, is she worthy of this? No. She's an outcast. She's a Moabitess. There is no way that this should be being done for her. And oh, by the way, where's Naomi? Just a little sideline question. Okay.
Watching soap operas, eating bonbons.
Okay, so now we've got this wonderful thing that Boaz has done. He's gone above and beyond the call, which, by the way, should be a statement to all of us. It's the call to all of us. We don't just do the minimum. And the point that's going to be made here ultimately is that because we have been graced, we then should grace abundantly. As we've been graced abundantly, we should grace abundantly to others. So here's what she does. So Ruth stood up and said to Boaz, it's about time. No, look at her response. So she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, why have I found grace? Ken. Now remember, she told Naomi, I hope to go glean in a field where I might find grace where I might find favor. And what's just happened? Not only has she found favor and grace, she's found it above and beyond. Why in the world would you have poured this kind of blessing on me? She actually says, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a what?
Foreigner.
Now, I want to take you just a moment to Romans chapter 5, verse 8. Statement in Romans 5:8 says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. This is grace. By the way, that word sinners there can also be translated enemies, can also be translated foreigners.
Wow.
While we were still foreigners, enemies, sinners, Christ still died for us. Does this sound straight out of the book of Ruth? Why have you found favor with me, since I am a foreigner? And by the way, Moab was an enemy. Since I am an enemy, since I am one you should not even be considering. What kind of an attitude is Ruth portraying here?
Humility.
She is gratefulness. She is absolutely walking in the grace that has been poured out on her. And the question we need to ask is this: when I get graced by God time and time and time again, do I in turn grace others? Do I recognize the abundance with which I've been graced? And do I in turn graciously, abundantly pour that on others? That should be the mark. This is what a person of character, a person of valor does. We recognize how graced we have been, and we pour that grace abundantly, not sparingly, not stingily. We pour that abundantly on others. Are we having fun yet? Is this just... Okay. So she fell on her face. She has this wonderful, humble spirit. Why should you take note of me, since I am a foreigner? And by the way, this is the same cry that we as Gentiles, before we were believers in Christ, we should be looking at Christ. We were outcasts. Why, Christ, would you look upon me with grace? Why would you in the world have that kind of favor? Boy, in this particular case, not necessarily by her actions or by her humility, but I can identify with Ruth, an outcast, a foreigner, that grace has been abundantly poured upon. Verse 11, Boaz answered and said to her, it has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. Boaz now says, the reason I have done this for you is because of what you have done for my relative. Because you graced Naomi, I'm gracing you. Because God has graced me, I'm gracing you because you have graced Naomi. Now, understand what Boaz actually does here. He actually repeats her covenant vow. He says, you left your father and mother. You left everything behind. Well, she says that I'm going where you go. I'm going to the land you go. He says you left the land of your birth, the place where you were born, the place where all your people are, and you've come here, and you've come to a people whom you did not know. This is an unbelievable sacrifice that you have made for your mother-in-law, who is my relative. Because you have graced her, I am gracing you. And I am gracing you because I have been graced by God. So here's what I would say. Is Ruth, by her actions, by the way she has done this, is she portraying God in what she's doing here? A faithful, covenant promise-keeping God who is taking care of them. Is Boaz showing this same God? Is he showing the world who God is?
Yes.
Simply by the actions of gracing one another. It's this marvelous, marvelous look at how grace, when it abounds, should be shared. Notice that Boaz doesn't say, hey, I'm this wealthy landowner, I'm going to leave all my food to myself, I'm going to keep it, I need it, it's going to make me money. No, he freely gives it. He freely shares it, and he freely graces others. Has Ruth noticed, has she recognized grace that's been poured upon her?
Yes.
Has Boaz recognized grace poured upon him?
Yes.
Do we recognize grace poured upon us?
I hope we do.
I hope we do. Amen. Okay, last two verses, and it's going to get really fun. So notice now who Boaz gives the credit to. The Lord repay your work with a full reward given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Who does he give credit to?
God.
Yeah, because let's face it, Boaz's wealth, his land, his property, this crop has come about because he stayed faithful and God created and built that crop after a famine. Boaz stayed in the land. The blessing is his. He's walking in the blessing, and he gives 100% credit to God and now extends that blessing to Ruth. The Lord repay your hard work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel. Man, he has now given her both barrels of who God is. And he gives her, this is the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Have you ever heard that phrase before?
Mm-hmm.
Where have you heard that phrase?
Psalm 91.
Okay, Psalm 91. In fact, let me read you Psalm 91, just this portion of it. Psalm 91 says, he who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in him I will trust. Surely he shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler, from the perilous pestilence. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. Anybody know who wrote that? David wrote it. And understand that Boaz is ultimately going to be the great-great-great-grandfather of David. No doubt David heard this story. No doubt David heard Boaz say this to Ruth. You have come to the Lord your God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Isn't that a cool connection point?
Yes.
This is something Boaz declares over Ruth. That line carries through David and up to Christ. And by the way, doesn't Christ say the same thing to Jerusalem? Doesn't he talk about Jerusalem as a mother hen wanting to gather them under her wing for refuge and protection? Do we think there's not connection between these? Woo-wee! So we get this wonderful connection. We get this wonderful blessing. I do ask the question, how do I bless others? Do I actually send the blessings of God upon others? How do I physically bless somebody else? Here, he is giving her the blessing of God and saying, you've recognized his protection. You've recognized his refuge. I am, by the way, going to give you that protection and refuge because I am graced by God. This is just that wonderful cyclical grace that goes one on top of another on top of another. And now I want you to see how she responds. She says, let me find, what's the word?
Favor. Chen.
Okay. Chen, let me find grace in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and you have spoken kindly. That kindly is the word we learned 2 weeks ago. It's the word chesed. It is, for you have spoken with loyal love to me. And here she calls herself your maidservant. Now I want to stop for just a second because this is one more connecting point. There are several women in Scripture that have been called maidservants. But there are only 2 women that have described themselves as a maidservant. This is the first, Ruth. Do you know the second?
Mary.
Mary. At the birth, when the angel comes and gives her the pronouncement, and she says, I am your maidservant, let it be done to me according to your word. It's the only 2 women in all of Scripture that call themselves maidservant. You think there's a connection between Ruth and Mary? The birth line of Christ, the cities of Bethlehem, the house of bread. Do we think there's a connection here?
Yes.
This is incredible to see what she calls herself. And then she finally describes herself, though I am not like one of your maidservants. I still recognize, though I am your maidservant, I'm not like one of yours. I'm still the outcast. I still recognize my place. I still recognize who I am and what I'm about. So we get kind of this wrap up to this first section. And if you're a Jewish audience, I need to ask you a question. If you're a Jewish audience, what now have you begun to see? List for me some of the blessings that have now been unfolded in these first 13 verses. Describe some blessings that you've seen, some graces, some favor that has been given. Provision of food,
And security.
security,
Family.
protection,
And
family.
inclusion.
Great one. Inclusion.
That's really
This is
good.
my daughter. You bet. She's now been called my daughter by both Naomi and Boaz.
Yeah.
What else have you seen?
God's providence of providing.
No
Ruth's
question.
direction
Yep. By
to
the
go in
way,
that land.
by coincidence, just wander into this field. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a God incident.
Yeah. What else have you seen?
Hope. He's
Ooh,
given
that's
her
a good
hope.
one. That's a good one. Tikva. Absolutely. We've seen hope. What else?
What? Kindness, yeah.
Oh, you bet. Absolutely. The loyal love, that chesed, the loyal love that has just been poured out. So, and we could go on because there's a whole lot of it here. If you look at how the servants treated, if you look at how the women probably treated her, you look at the gleanings and the abundance of gleanings, you look at the provision that God has left, you look at the grace that has been abounding, and that's just on Ruth. Let's talk about Boaz for a minute. How's he been graced?
Yeah.
Wealth, fields, grain, places for people to work, respect. Over and over and over again, there is this. So if you're a Jewish audience, what you're seeing here is blessing, blessing. And by the way, where's she returned?
Covenant
To the land.
Land.
She's back in the land. I'll say it again. Who's now the recipient of all this blessing directly? Ruth. She's out. She's the outcast. She's out. The outcast is the one who's getting all this blessing. Who is going to get the blessing, though she isn't out there?
Naomi.
Yeah. God is still providing for her. Naomi is being true. Boaz has been true. We see these two begin to come together. Boaz goes above and beyond. Has Ruth gone above and beyond?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So with an overarching statement that I want to leave you with, a question here, and I'm going to read a very quick poem. Do I believe that I am graced by God? Do you believe you've been graced by God?
Yes.
Do we act like it?
Not always.
So the question then is, if I've been graced, how then do I share that grace with others? How then do I share the recognition of God's grace that is abundantly around me? How do I share that with others? We see Boaz doing it. We see Ruth doing it. Unfortunately, we see Naomi sitting in, nursing her grudge. Ultimately, just hang in because she's going to get there in chapter 4. But the question is, we see grace all around us. We see ourselves graced time and time time again. And I just pray that we are not believers that don't recognize the grace, or we take the grace for granted. Because what God desires is, as he has graced us, that we grace others. And we see a marvelous example in these two people of character. And their character comes to the forefront in the midst of this gracing by God. So here's a little poem, and I'm going to leave you with this. It's called If I Had Only Known. It's by two women, Nancy Spielberg and Dorothy Purdy. And it's a very short poem, but it is incredibly convicting. It goes like this. Lord, I crawled across the barrenness to you with my empty cup, uncertain in asking any small drop of refreshment. If I had only known you better, I would have come running with a bucket. God desires to bless us overwhelmingly. And unfortunately, we come to him too many times with a cup instead of a bucket. And the beautiful thing about a bucket is it allows us to pour it out on other people. God desires to bless us, to grace us, so that we can manifest him to others, share him with others. We see in Ruth and Boaz, we see the grace of God magnificently through these two people. Do I recognize it? When I'm blessed with it, do I share it? And do I share it abundantly? Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. We'll end the chapter next week. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Lots to think about, I know.
Now's the time.
I find it interesting, and I think somebody mentioned about how did Ruth know about the covenant, about the gleaning?
Yes.
And it would have to have been from Naomi, right? And it seems
yes.
from other things when she was talking about wanting Naomi to be God, to be her God. Naomi seemed to have taught Ruth an awful lot, but didn't apply it to herself.
Yeah. Well, and let's, again, what we'd love to be able to say is we'd love to be able to see Ruth walking, or Naomi walking where Ruth walks. We'd love to see that. And hang on, because she will get there. But let's not forget where Naomi is. Naomi is still looking at God and saying, you're to blame for my situation. And there is a lesson there for us. The lesson there, and actually this was a lesson big for the nation of Israel, who used to blame God for their oppression, though they were the ones who wandered away from it. The question is, or the response needs to be, am I continuing to return to God? Have I walked away from him? Am I sitting outside because I've walked away from God himself? And where should I be? Should I be turned and walking back toward him where the blessing is? Because even when I have walked away from him, there's no better place to be than in the presence of God, because he is the one that administers forgiveness. He's the one that administers grace. He's the one that administers peace. He's the one that administers comfort. I need to be sitting in the midst of the one sitting at the feet of the one who administers that. We'd love to be seeing Naomi go, get out there, experience the blessing. She's not there yet. And I'll say it again, there are many times in which it takes me time to I don't recognize God immediately. It takes me time to recognize God and how much I've been graced so that I can ultimately get there. Yes, I think Naomi shared a whole lot of who she was, but remember, she was in a foreign land for 10 years, a really evil foreign land for 10 years. That had to have taken its toll. And so we see her, whoever it was that said it, I'm going to adopt the phrase, she's nursing her grudge. It's a great phrase. I'm going to hang on to that one, because that's who she is. And she is still walking in, this is a huge play in this whole book. She's still walking in, I've got to solve this myself. This is human wisdom. Ruth is already walking in God's wisdom. She's already walking in the covenant promises. Boaz has never left it. So we're going to wait and see Naomi begin to walk in the covenant promise. We're going to see her begin to walk like she knows she should, but it's going to take her some time. She's not there yet. So
It's interesting
as God is patient with us, we need to be patient with Naomi.
It's interesting though that Ruth was in that same idolatry country too that Naomi was, and she didn't have the background to begin with that Naomi did. I guess maybe Ruth came from, she could see how bad this was where she was living, and saw what Naomi had was so much better. When sometimes Naomi, I know I can be like her. I don't appreciate what I had. Yeah, and she because even when I'm in a foreign land, getting in a foreign land, sometimes I don't appreciate what I have.
It's almost as if Naomi takes God for granted.
Yeah.
Naomi takes God for granted all that time. And for Ruth, it's fresh and new. I mean, when you share the gospel and somebody new comes to Christ, all of a sudden, everything they're learning, everything they're experiencing is all fresh and new for them. And by the way, it really becomes fresh and new for us as we disciple them and walk them through it. It's really fun to help somebody grow in their relationship with Christ. And the beauty of what Christ does is he helps us grow in our relationship with him too because of that relationship. Here, you're just dying for Naomi to walk alongside Ruth and see all this wonderful stuff that God is blessing her, and yet she's sitting back in the house. And we're going to see at the end of chapter 1 when Ruth shows up and says, boom, look at everything God did. She still isn't going to learn it. It's going to take her till the end of chapter 3 to learn it. But
hey, Mark.
We're pulling for her.
Mark,
Yes.
can I just, an observation, just when you think about how life breaks us, I mean, Naomi, she lost her husband. I mean, I think about that and I think that would just destroy me if I lost my husband. But then I also lost my 2 sons, my only sons. And that would take a lot to get over and that grieving. And then if you didn't have any support where you were living and no support systems and everything, you'd be walking alone in that grief. And when it doesn't have an outlet, you could start thinking a lot of things about who God is and how come this happened and on, and bitterness was set in and blah, blah, blah. So, on the other side, you really grieve for her because she lost sight of God in her life. And it's so awesome when God uses, like he's using Ruth, who, it's just amazing. But yeah, I feel for Naomi, and it'd be easy for me to go, man, you're forgetting all the things of what God said and the covenant and all that. But when you look at it from a human standpoint, that's a broken woman.
Yes.
It truly seems to be a story of lost hope and found hope.
Yeah.
Lost hope for Naomi, but found hope for Ruth. And that seems to be
found
the
hope
story.
for Naomi.
Yeah.
But isn't it a fascinating thing that hope for Naomi is going to eventually come through the outcast?
Yes.
So maybe one of the lessons here is when we least expect it, God shows up, and he shows up in ways that we may never dream because we're not necessarily looking for him. And Tammy, let me go back to your statement. Yes, she is walking this, though it's been 10 years since all that occurred. But what we see is a woman who got used to not seeing God in the everyday. And I think what the story of chapter 2 begins to tell us is, are we trying to recognize God's promise in the midst of us? Because the first thing that he promises is, I will never leave you or forsake you. I'm not leaving your side. And notice what Naomi says at the end of chapter 1. She says, basically, God, you left me. And God's saying, no, actually, I didn't. I was there all the time. And not only that, I brought Ruth with you. And if you kind of take a look at Ruth, you're going to see the joy and the beauty of me being in your midst. But you're right. She's got to get beyond the hurt. And it's beautiful that God has provided Ruth and will ultimately provide Boaz, who will take her to that point. And so I think there's a huge element of this of, do we look around? Do we look specifically to see God in our midst, to see him at work in our midst? And when we do see him, how do we respond to that? Do we respond with, boy, I see his grace upon me, therefore I'm going to give it to others? Or do I see it, I'm now going to be so inside myself? I mean, Naomi is just, she's in her own little box. In her own little box, there's nothing outside of that. Well, look at who Ruth's been introduced to. Now she's got Boaz, she's got servants, she's got reapers, she's got people, the women of Bethlehem. She's been introduced to this whole new community where Naomi's still sitting in the house. It is, how do I recognize God and get out in the midst of it?
And you know, Mark, sometimes you can't see God working, but you have faith to know that he
Yes.
is.
Yeah.
So you still
Yes.
live with hope because you know he's working in ways you don't even realize.
Yes.
That's faith.
On
I
both the
guess
big
you-
stage and the small stage. Yeah.
And you still see God just pursuing Naomi over and over and over
Mm.
until she gets it
Mhm.
in chapter 4.
Hey, don't go ahead of time.
That's right.
I think also, I think that one thing that I would want to add is when you feel yourself, and I'm speaking of myself here, but when you find yourself at that place where you have lost hope, which is a place I was at one point in my life, when I found that hope again, my faith was much, much stronger. So I had grown, and that's been a journey, that memory, I never want to go back.
Mm.
And so in that journey, I continue to grow and have that desire to grow because I never want to go back to that place of lost hope again.
Well, you know, there's a conference coming up on February 23rd.
Yeah.
I've been
The
informed
basis-
about that.
The basis of the conference, though, is this, that life breaks all of us.
Yeah.
Pain, loss of hope, failure, struggles, sin, doubt, suffering, that life breaks us. But God enters into that brokenness and creates something strong, beautiful, joyful, that never would have been there had the brokenness not occurred, that we actually become more strong at those broken places than if they'd never been broken in the past. What we see in Ruth, and let's make sure we remember that Ruth lost her husband. Ruth has gone to a foreign land. Ruth is, I mean, if anybody didn't have hope, the only thing Ruth's clinging to right now is Naomi, and look at who she's clinging to. Naomi is this, right now, she's an angry, she's an angry woman. You know, there's kind of that, why would you want to be with her? But she knows what's attached to Ruth is the God of the universe. So she's come back, even in her grief, she's come back, and yet we see her following the covenant promise. We see her, and what we see God doing is basically saying, you're walking in it now, watch me bless you. And who's recognizing the blessing? Ruth is recognizing the blessing because she's actually walking with God. Naomi still doesn't recognize it yet because she's put God on the shelf. I'm done with him because he did this to me. So that brokenness, Naomi's in a broken place, Ruth is in a broken place. And by the way, Boaz, in a famine, was in a broken place. But let's look at how God moves to strengthen those. The beautiful thing is that he's already at work at Ruth. He's already at work in Boaz. Naomi just hasn't opened herself up yet to the fact that God could be at work. And that's, I mean, it's a huge lesson for us that even in our brokenness, even in those tough times, God enters in, and if at the very least says, I'm not going to leave you or forsake you, which the beauty of that is that's the God of the universe who says, I'm not leaving you. That's marvelous. So.
And, you know, I think there's another lesson in here for Naomi, and that is because I have been through depression. and she needs to get out of that house. I'm telling you, that is the truth. She needs to take a walk outside and see the sky and see, everything else in nature. And I think, if she'd have gotten out of the house and helped glean, she'd have been better by now.
I think that's the reason Ruth wanted to go glean.
I know. That's right. She goes, I got to get out of this house. Anyway, I just see that as, you can't stay stuck in the house either. So I know this is all about God's timing, but poor thing.
But when you're depressed,
Yeah.
clinical depression,
It is real.
you want to stay not
Where you
only
are.
in your house, but in your bed with the covers over your head.
Yeah.
So, that's a good point, is that sometimes you just have to make yourself get up. And
But I have a feeling
move
next
forward.
week when Ruth comes and tells her what's going on, she's going to think about going outside. Mark, this was great. Any other questions for Mark?
I have an observation, Mark.
Sure.
About Boaz, of Boaz blessing the harvesters. And then in verse 12, to me, he's blessing Ruth.
Yes.
May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel. And so for him to say the God of Israel, I'm almost thinking about back to Israel being a blessing to draw the Gentiles in. He's blessing a Gentile woman.
Yep.
He's a type of Christ to me, a type of Jesus, that he blesses her and then says, under whose wings, again, to me, it's a picture of salvation. So like you said, she walked back to the land with Naomi, and yet she, like the prodigal, walking back, is now under a blessing of salvation.
Well, think of it, and it's a great point. We're going to learn the title, the actual title of Boaz, what he is known as. It's a beautiful. I'm going to hold on that one. But the second thing that you need to understand is they're still walking under the Abrahamic covenant. And what was the Abrahamic covenant? We're promising you land, seed, blessing forever.
Blessing.
That was God's blessing upon them. And so, yes, he is this beautiful statement that he makes, that the Lord repay your work, a full reward given you by the Lord God of Israel. The nation of Israel was meant to be God's physical manifestation and blessing. Remember, whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. The nation of Israel was meant to be that blessing in order to draw the Gentiles, and it's exactly correct. And so you get this beautiful statement of the unfolding of God's grace through Boaz onto Ruth, one who is an outcast. It's a marvelous picture, and that's going to continue. We're going to see that even more so in chapter 3 as we look at that covenant relationship continue. But hang on, because you're going to give away a really huge portion of this when we get to chapter 3. Yep.
I peeked ahead.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you all. We'll see you next week.
Yes, you will. Bye-bye.
Yes, he's doing really well, but you can't get it takes a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, can't get it soft. That's right. So you can my son.
I got everything.